Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Aye, kuwe kuamadue.
Could you please state your name?
My name is Ronald Cole Bridgeforth. My mother named me Ronald. I named myself Cole. Cole is my preference.
Thank you. Well, starting off with that, get to know Baba Cole. Let's start off with, where did you grow up?
Well, I really grew up in two places. One, I was born here in Berkeley, 1944 during World War II. My mother was like 16 years old and grew up as a farm girl in southeast Arkansas. But getting pregnant while still in high school was they sent her away. So she came out here to stay with my oldest aunt, Maudel Sherrick, who actually became a city council member in Berkeley for about 20 years. But so I was born here and then went back to Arkansas because I was the first grandchild and a boy. So whatever transgressions my grandfather felt about my mother's refusing to marry whoever my father was forgiven because now he had a boy child, grandchild, which she's resented for most of her life, like, okay, so I'm all right as long as I have a little ding-a-ling for a child. But anyway, I went back to Arkansas. I lived on a farm for about 5-6 years with my grandparents and my youngest uncle and my youngest aunt. And the only one of those 10 children that are left are my Aunt Lenny Jean, who's down in South LA. My uncle, Eddie Madison Miller Jr., died in Korea. He's about 20 years old. I still grieve his loss. So I spent those, until I was about 6 and a half, I stayed on that farm, and it was wonderful. It was idyllic. It was a kind of small town where you had two churches, Methodist and Baptist, and we didn't have enough people to fill both churches every Sunday, so they'd go back and forth, and you had the ministers that came in, riding circuit, and that whole thing. But it was like, I think probably I was a prince. My grandfather, he owned a farm and he fed 11 kids on it, but he was an educator. And he spent much of his life going into small towns in Arkansas, starting schools.
Wow.
In the local churches. And you have to talk with white school board members to convince them that it was not going to interrupt with bringing in crops and planting crops, because the black kids are only going to go to school 6 months out of the year and not 9. But he felt like he had a 12th grade education, which made him probably one of the most educated men, black or white, in that area of the county. But that was his avocation, and I carried that with me. So the next part, my mother got married when she was about, I don't know how she was, but I was about 6 or 7. And she had gone back to California, come back to California from Arkansas, and she was going to City College of Los Angeles City College. And ultimately she wound up going to the University of Southern California School of Pharmacy. She was maybe the second black woman to go through that school. But she got married, and I came out to stay with her and my stepfather, David William. Bridgeforth is where the name came from. And we lived in Compton. And it was not the Compton of NWA, it was Compton of working class black families who were, it's one of the few places that black GIs could buy land in California back in the 50s. So this is a whole community of a subdivision that stretched from about 120th to, I lived on 139th, so into the 40s, that were basically black families. working class. He was a mechanic for this city, I think. So it was interesting. I mean, it was different in that I came in there with a Southern accent, kind of chubby, wore glasses, had a smart mouth. Got popped in it a few times, you know, but that didn't deter me. So, but being different sort of established a pattern in my life. You know. So I stayed there until I was 17.
Wow. So who or what influenced you the most as a child?
Probably my grandfather, my Uncle Junior, my mother, of course. We belonged, or she helped found a Presbyterian church in South LA, 118th Street, called Bellevue. And I spent much of my childhood in and out of church. You know, everything from usher board to, I love Sunday school. It was just philosophical debates, you know.
Oh, nice.
They had to explain to me why 3/4 of the world's population were damned to hell because they weren't Christian. That wasn't logical to me. But the deacon who was teaching it, old school, hell yeah, that's the way it is. So it was a good time. Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, Explorer Scouts. Spent a lot of time at the church. And so the minister, Reverend St. Paul Epps, real name, he was our minister, and he had a lot of influence on me, as did the Boy Scout masters and all of these people, you know, that touched my life. Some of the teachers, there were a couple of teachers in high school who came up from the South, from Louisiana and from Texas, who could see, we had a high school, Centennial High School. Centennial is the same high school that, I don't know that boy. Who? Not important. It's a rapper.
Okay.
He came through several generations after me.
Okay.
But Centennial was built to siphon off black and Mexican kids from Compton High School. Compton High School at that time was all white. Of course, now it's all Mexican and black, but then it was all white. And so they built Centennial High on Central and El Segundo, and that school was 75% black and 25% Latina. And so there were black men teachers who really kind of looked out for the young black men who were going to school there, because they knew what was coming. We didn't. I mean, we lived in a pretty insular community of black folks. And interestingly enough, I had a teacher in the 5th grade named Mrs. Fox, white woman. I haven't seen her since. But in her class, she did a thing with history. That was the curriculum of 5th grade. And so she had a Jeopardy thing where she'd divide the kids into 2 teams, and every Friday we just answered questions as long as we could. She picked me as one of the captains.
Oh, cool.
And it was in that classroom I realized that, you have something between your ears that you can ride. And after I discovered I had some intelligence, you couldn't talk to me no more, no matter what they did. So, yeah, it's interesting who can influence your life. And it's important to, I think, honor them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned you were in Compton, I believe, till you said 17?
Until I was 17.
About 17. And did you come to Oakland after that, or?
I went to school. I went away to a school called Sterling College in Kansas, which was a Presbyterian school, because my grades were pretty bad by the time I graduated. I read everything, I read everything in the library all through middle school and the first couple of years of high school. And then about the 11th grade, I discovered girls and I stopped reading. And, and I stopped studying. So my grades were like C's. And so my minister got me into Sterling College, which was a small 500 student Presbyterian college in semi-rural Kansas. 500 students, 2 black students. So I stayed there a year and a half and learned to hate it, because Kansas ain't that far from Mississippi, really. And then after the second semester of my second year, I transferred to Knoxville College in Knoxville, Tennessee, also a Presbyterian college. About 800 students, and maybe there were 10 of them that were white. Remember, I was born into a segregated world. I mean, seriously, it's still segregated, but no, you did ride on the back of the bus kind of thing.
Yeah.
So by then I was 19. And I announced to my family that I was going to Mississippi to work for something called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee for the summer of 1964. And of course, they were terrified. They knew stuff I didn't know, my family did. Like that my family ultimately came from Oakland, Mississippi in the Delta in 1877, right after the Civil War. They had to escape from there. They knew all of that. They didn't talk about it. I didn't know nothing. I thought I was, I mean, as a church camps and stuff I went to, we worked on Indian reservations when I was a teenager and all that stuff. That's what I thought we were doing. Now we spent a week in Oxford, Ohio, at a university. They were trying to prepare us to go into Mississippi. And they were trying to get our attention that this is serious. These people kill you. We didn't get it until the weekend I was supposed to go down, and did go down to Mississippi. 3 civil rights workers disappeared.
Wow.
Goodman, Swarner, and Cheney. And the Black Mississippi staff, they said they're dead. And the rest of them were like, how could that be? Yeah. And in fact, they were dead.
It's terrifying.
They sent me to a town that was 50 miles away from where those brothers died. And you start to get a little more serious about Mississippi is lethal. Now, they sent 950 students to Mississippi that summer for that summer project. And about 900 of them were white. About 50 of us were black. And what became clear over time was, had they just sent black students into Mississippi for that summer, they would have put us in the river too. But because there were white students from Michigan and Cal Berkeley and Harvard, all kinds of, they only recruited the children of the ruling class, as they call it. When those students came in, they brought with them their families, their local newspapers, the black and white TV. And so that caused the president, whoever it was at that time, probably Lyndon Johnson, no, we cannot allow those kids to be killed. So they sent in the FBI, and the Justice Department, and it kept us alive. That's realistically, if you go back and look at, there was a speech that Julian Bond made in 2014 at the 60th anniversary. Maybe it was the 50th anniversary of the Summer Project, where he laid it out. The decision was made by Bob Moses, who was a state project director. Bob just passed away this year. That even though there was an argument that bringing all these white students into Mississippi would rob the local people of their agency, because they could come in and type and run mimeograph machines, and we were learning to do that.
Right.
That until SNCC changed the metrics, that Mississippi was going to continue to kill black people, and the rest of the country was just going to look away. So they said, well, bring some white folks in here and see what happens next. And what happened was we broke open the state. I don't know what the question is anymore.
No, you were just, giving the history and your background for after you moved
Oh.
initially. So, this is it's very interesting. And just following that, I mean, just having that experience, how did that change, I guess, the way you were looking at society and things when going into Mississippi and having all these, experiences?
I just read a book named Caste, and I can't think of the rest of the name, but it's by a woman by the name of Wilkerson. And she also wrote another book called Warmth of the Other Sun, which really chronicles the migration of black folks from the South to the North, West, and East. Maybe 7 million of us, because we weren't here before. And this was like from the 1910, 1920 through 1950s. Now I guess some are going back. But anyway, this book on caste talks about that the way our society is structured, it doesn't matter how much education we get, how much wealth we get, it's still designed to keep us in place. Now, I was raised, as my parents were raised, to believe that if we did the right thing, if we lived good lives, that we got education, we went to church, we dressed well, did all that stuff, that they would stop killing us. And what Cass points out is that ain't true. We have to do something else. So I don't know what I would have done differently had I understood at 19 and 20 what that book explains. I probably would have done something different. I don't know what that was, a bit. But I believed in lifting up yourself by your own bootstraps. Upsuasion, one brother calls it, that we can just be better. Which also flips to the Bill Cosby thing of if we would just do right.
Right, yeah.
And I don't want to curse on this film, so, it's just bull. Doesn't matter. So, in Mississippi, as a young black man in this country in the 60s, early 60s, there were not the LeBron Jameses of the world, the Stephen Currys, or the Obamas. It was difficult to determine what you could be and who. I didn't want to be my minister. I definitely didn't want to be my stepfather. I didn't even understand my grandfather. So I'm looking around, And when I joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I found brothers who were like myself. A lot of them from Harlem and DC, and they knew a lot more than me. But they had a spirit about them. And so what I found in Mississippi was purpose. I saw in the eyes of the folks that I worked with, as humble as their surroundings were, I saw in their eyes a reflection of me as a young black man who had value. At any rate, they changed my life. They changed the way I saw the world. And so I spent the rest of my life, the next 50 years, trying to live a life of which they might be proud. Trying to, I spent my 20s, I moved from Mississippi. I moved from Mississippi to San Francisco in '65. Okay. And I worked for SNCC there, raising money and doing educational programs. And then SNCC dissolved at the end of '66, right as the Panthers were rising. And so you didn't have to be a Panther to be in their sphere of influence of the way they saw the world. And my wife was out there at San Francisco State in the Black Student Union. They're striking. It was a hell of a time in the Bay. Free speech movement, all kinds of stuff. Farm workers are going on. So that was my next ideological leap. I grew up I thought about being a minister at 15 and 16, But when we started reading the Red Book and Mao Zedong and all them folks in the 60s, we became materialists, dialectical materialists, which is there is no God kind of thing. And so we had our education groups where we'd read and discuss and all of that, and we learned to buy guns and arm ourselves for self-defense. I'm not sure how that was going to work, but anyway, it's a good theory. Because white folks always had more guns than we were going to have.
Yeah.
But, so I moved from the nonviolence of the South to the self-defense of the North. This is like, you get whiplash doing this stuff. I mean, between 62 and 66, that happened. And after SNCC dissolved, I started organizing young black men in the Fillmore. I had spoken at a high school up near Golden Gate Park, and a couple of the brothers after I spoke, I was talking about the South, they said, well, can you organize us here? And so we started. We had about 20 young men. Oh, man. So, okay. I think we'll just, that takes me there.
Takes you there. I'm just sure just having that wealth of experience going from Mississippi to San Francisco and then SNCC ending, it's a year, right after you got there essentially, and then just really having to pivot and find your way in a different spot with so many other movements happening at the same time and just being in midst of all of that, that changing your politics too, and just reading and having all those experiences. I'm sure this question would have been different if I asked you, say, in the 60s, but right now, what would you say, what does it mean to be black in America? What does it mean to you now?
It's to be, have a double consciousness, not in the way the Du Bois looked at it, but in the way that, for me, it's to live with love and rage simultaneously. The thing I left Mississippi with was rage. And they were going to draft me. I was, and all that stuff, and I didn't want to go to Vietnam, and it was just madness. But they reclassified me and said, we don't want you in Vietnam. Smart decision for them and me. But I was pretty much, all through my 20s, just angry. I'm really pissed. What happened in Mississippi was we went to the Atlantic City Democratic Convention in 1964 in August. And that's where the Freedom Democratic Party of Mississippi, which was biracial, integrated, led by a sister by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, made her famous appeal to the Credentials Committee of the Democratic Convention and said, look, your rules say that you will not seat segregated state parties. And the Mississippi Party is all white. We are integrated. You should seat us. And Lyndon Johnson said, if I seat the Negroes from Mississippi, I'm going to lose the Southern vote, and I won't be president the next time around. So they cut a deal. They offered 2 seats to their party, and Fannie Lou Hamer said, we didn't come here for no 2 seats. And so we were rebuffed. But in my young brain, 19 and 20, it's like, we've done everything that you said we should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you say, yeah, but. So a lot of us left the South really disillusioned. People went in their different directions. I went to embracing armed revolution. So during my 20s, I was pretty much angry and enraged. And walking on the edge of staying alive. I really, I had a lot of idealism, about, I'd be willing to trade my life if we could free my people. Yeah. It ain't that simple, though. Mm. And it wasn't until my first son was born, in '73, and I was about 29, that I came to grips with life, because that wasn't just me anymore. Now, I'll digress a bit. I met my biological father in 2015. He was already in his 90s.
Wow.
Very successful, PhD in math, taught at a black college down there in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where my mother had gone to school as a high schooler. His absence in my life was a determinant for me. It shaped my journey as much as anything he could have done if had he been present. Not knowing my father was extraordinarily painful for me. I can't even emphasize how painful it was, because I shut it off for years. Didn't matter. It did matter.
Yeah.
And I meet young men now who say, it don't matter. I say, it might. It might not matter. I can't tell you what it does for you. It mattered for me. So when my son was born, I came to a full stop. And I said, I don't want my child to experience the pain that I experienced of growing up without a father. And for that reason, I made two critical decisions, and I made a promise to him that I was going to stay alive, and stay out of jail. And that meant I had to live my life differently. And whatever pipe dreams I had about dying in the revolution and all that, get that. Stay alive, stay out of jail. And I told him. He saved my life because he gave me a reason to live.
Wow.
So that took me through my 20s. Now I got two sons, and decided, okay, you're smart. I'm moving furniture for a living. And it's like, that's a pack animal. So I guess I need to go back to school. So I went to school. I went back to where my grandfather would have had me go, which is become an educator.
Okay.
It fits quite naturally with me.
I'm sure that had a big impact, not just because you making the conscious decision to further education, and again, it's not just you anymore. It's the family now. So it's like you seeing the larger implications of that, and just moving forward, like how can I take care of them in a more holistic way, and in a better situation. And especially if you're doing a lot of things regarding moving furniture or things that becomes a big burden physically. Eventually, you can have back issues and all those things to go along with that.
Yeah, I was very clear about that. It would be remiss of me not to mention that I've been married for 50 years. Probably more, to do the counting. But yeah, over 50 years. And I blame my wife for that, because I was a serious fool for most of my 20s and 30s, just a fool. And she hung in there with me. And I credit her along with my sons, for why I get to sit here now. I don't know if she ever regrets it, but what can I say? It's the choice she made. And I've tried to be a good husband. I was married before that. It was my second marriage. The first marriage I screwed up. I just messed up. I wasn't ready to be married, and acted, showed it. But one thing I learned from that was I never wanted to hurt anybody that bad again. And so the second time I tried, I'm like, this is for life.
It's fine. I hear that. Yeah, it's a big part of experiences is just learning from whatever past mistakes or just ways you could have made a decision differently. As you said, it's just impacting you in a way, and said, I don't want to go this route again. And really following up on that and having it as a determinant for you moving forward to, moving to the next stage of your life. So it sounds like that, that experience, especially being married the first time, was, just kind of also helped to kind of lead you on the path to the life that you have now. A big one. So,
Fair enough.
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, just moving from that, I'm curious, just from these experiences you've had, what would you say are some lessons that you've learned about society or Black society?
I've never accomplished anything of significance without help. Although, I grew up in the American way of, rugged individualism and all that crap. The truth is that you're not going to get anywhere without help. Mm-hmm. Finding it can be an issue for you. Accepting it can even be a bigger issue. I have trouble with that one. What else? Go back to the question again.
Sure. What are some lessons you've learned about Black society and just, as you've been through all these different experiences?
Never give up, never quit. Live life for your people, and you'll never die. That sounds kind of, I don't know, might sound kind of weird, but that's the way I see it. I was thinking about this morning, that it's the analogy, the story that Native Americans are attributed to, Native Americans, about having two wolves inside of us. Oh, yeah. And the question is, which wolf do you feed? Well, as I said earlier, I have rage, and then I have love. And the thing that happened when my son was born, first son, was that I stopped feeding that first wolf, which was rage and anger. Legitimate rage and anger. These folks were trying to kill us out here.
Yeah.
And I started feeding that wolf that loved and wanted to nurture. And education fell into that. Because that's, even I became a counselor. I got a master's in counseling, and I was a community college counselor, but I still focused on, this is an educational process. This is not a shrinking process. I'm not going to talk a hole in anybody's head. I'm going to help people learn to manage their own journey. Black folks are beautiful, resilient, persistent, determined. And focus on that. Yeah. Not on what white folks are doing to us, although they're doing a lot. That is not the key that opens the door. It's like even with the Brotherhood of Elders, I understand about the politics of Oakland or America, or California, and all of that. But that's not where I focus my energy. My energy is about how do we build a network of brothers. That's what I found in Mississippi with SNCC. It was a network of brothers and sisters. And that's what I found here. And every place I've stopped along the way, I've tried to build those networks, whether it was here in West Africa. I did not mention that I spent 2.5 years in Senegal and Gambia in the late 60s and
wow.
Early 70s.
Were you teaching, or what were you doing out there?
Oh, I didn't have no degree. No, I was escaping America.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that if I got out of here, the madness would disappear. Wasn't true. Brought the madness with me. But I met a lot of good brothers. In fact, my oldest son is named for my best friend, who is Senegalese, Omar, Job. I didn't know a lot. I hadn't studied our history. I'm living in Dakar with a family. I didn't know anything about Gorée Island, which is right off the coast. I mean, within a canoe, a boat ride. I didn't know that there was a slave castle there, any of that stuff. Now, one of the people who lived there, who were Senegalese, they knew it was there, but they didn't talk about it, which is one of the themes of being in Africa. But I was adopted into a family that extended from Gambia, which was English speaking, to Dakar, which was French speaking, and I moved back and forth between them. I was pretty poor, but I had a ticket home. That was a requirement to get a visa. But in the end, somebody asked me the other night, why did you come home? This is where my blood is. I mean, there's something about culture. It's like the water. And you may be, in fact, I met at the Senegalese Ballet general rehearsal. Omar and I were hanging out with the cast, or the dancers, and being an American in 1969 or 70, I was sort of like a celebrity, you know. I mean, hey, people want to speak English, want to know what's going on, you know, and all that stuff. But after that after the laughing and joking, a brother walked up to us and said, I'm such and such, and I'm from Cleveland. Now, he was deeply immersed. He looked like any other African there, and he was a dancer or a drummer or whatever he was. And he'd been there about 8 years, but he was still not Senegalese. He could speak French and he could speak Wolof, but he wasn't Senegalese, and he was preparing to go home. Because although he hated what was happening in Cleveland, it was still his home.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I experienced, that it's time, you know. You're not going to find peace here.
I get that. You got to, essentially sounds like you've been searching for that, or, you know, even to escape it and go to other places and, you know, having those experiences.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's one way of looking at it, at least that part of my life.
Or maybe some was the piece was when you started having children, finding some of that maybe?
Yeah, children settled me down, gave me a reason. I was still pretty crazy. I've been pretty crazy most of my life, but you know, it's relative, I guess.
Like that.
Go ahead.
Okay. What would you say are maybe the top 3 things or that you would think are the most harmful that you've seen happen to the black community or in the black community?
You know, Stokely Carmichael once said, and I got to know him when I was in the South and actually here in San Francisco. He said the worst thing that white folks did to us was not to enslave us, although they did. The worst thing they did was teach us to hate ourselves. And I've subscribed to that. So what do we have to do? We have to love ourselves. I mean, that was the switch that happened in my life, that forget the anger, get with the love.
Yeah.
So love yourself as an individual, which can be a struggle. Love your family, love your community. And you start to dig deep into black folks' history and culture. It is a beautiful thing, for me anyway. It's just, we're an extraordinary people. Now, yes, we are living in a slave society, and many of us are really being subjected to that on a daily basis in these prisons and in these exploitive jobs. I mean, you drive through Oakland, see all the homelessness and all of that, and you're like,
Yeah.
the wealthiest country in the world. It's just, you can't ignore that. But I still think the thing that harms us most is we don't love ourselves as much as we could or should.
I get that. And what do you think?
Oh,
go ahead.
lack of education.
Lack of education.
I don't know. Not taking advantage of the education. But it's the reason why, you know, they start getting rid of affirmative action in these schools. We were turning out folks who could lead. And now we still turn them out in black colleges, but education is a linchpin, in my opinion. It's certainly attributed to why I get to sit here All that reading I did in the middle school and early high school, my mother's a pharmacist. She's passed away in 2017. My grandfather was a school principal. Those were the foundation pieces that allowed me to navigate America.
Wow. And just around that, I think you started to speak to this. What are some ways that you feel like we can fix these issues, especially around loving ourselves? Like you mentioned, having so much hate for each other, not understanding that. What do you think are some ways we can fix some of these issues?
It's just the reverse of what I said, which is reach deep, find love, find something that you would do for free if you could afford to, and find a way to get paid for it exceptionally well. The most precious thing we have is life. It's this breath. The first thing I sometimes ask students, what's the first thing a child has to do or baby has to do when they're born? And they say cry, they say this, that, that. To me, it's take a breath. And what's the last thing you give back when you leave here? Breath. So the great blessing for me is that I woke up this morning and had the gift of breath. Now, what am I going to do with that? Is the question for me. And so, that's the answer. Go to school, learn every way you can, read, love, fight. Just find a way. I had to identify the tools that I needed to use. Some people have become doctors. You're a journalist. His brother's a videographer. These are all tools to the liberation of our people. And so mine was education. It's still education. That's why we're doing this storytelling.
That's right. And speaking of which, what would you say liberation means to you in 2021?
I thought about that earlier, and I can't. I'm not going to answer it directly. I'm going to answer it another way.
Okay.
When I look at the two of you, it validates the journey I've made in my life. So what does liberation look like to me? It looks like a world in which y'all could exist. And y'all get to determine what that looks like. But the fact that you get to determine that is everything.
I hear that. Never hear that. Wow. Well, I think part of that is just the fact that we have resources available and are able to at least have these conversations. And one of the big reasons I think that even we're here today as well is the Brotherhood of Elders Network, kind of bringing us together to work on this project together and move forward. And I'm curious, how has the Brotherhood of Elders Network impacted your life?
Well, I don't know. It's like a home. As I said earlier, I have spent most of my life trying to build or be part of groups of young men, not so young anymore, who are committed to making a difference in our world. And the Brotherhood of Elders, and I lived in Michigan for like 30-some years. And I was successful there. I mean, I rose from a janitor to a director of employment, to faculty member and union leader and all of that stuff. But I wasn't, while I had, and still do have good friends there, they did not see the world in the way I see the world. I mean, it's, church, sorority, fraternity, job. Those are the three pillars. Those weren't three pillars. I didn't go to church anymore, didn't belong to a fraternity. I worked. And I built student groups, and I built basketball leagues, and not alone, of course, but so when I got here, and Greg Hodge said, you need to come to the Brotherhood of Elders meeting. I was like, what's up with that? So he talked to me for a while, and I came, and it was like, oh, these brothers look like me. They think like me. You know, I kind of see my journey as being on a path, right? Mm-hmm. And I've always, most of my life, especially those years in Michigan, there wasn't anybody in front of me. I'm trying to create the path with kids behind me. I got here, I met Arnold Perkins. I said, oh, wait a minute now. There's a brother on the path in front of me. Yeah. And that was gratifying, you know. And I looked back and said, oh, there's some brothers behind me. It just fit. Mm-hmm. It just fit. And not everybody who comes to the Brotherhood stays. I mean, you know, they pass through a lot, maybe most. But for the ones who stay, who are like me, they have found something that just fit. You could say these are my ideological brothers, whatever you want to say, but yeah, it was the first time since I left the South that I felt most comfortable. I don't mind working. Just give me a purpose. And building the Brotherhood was, I can live with that. And as I said earlier, when I see these young men behind me, and maybe behind isn't the right word, maybe they're in front of me now, I am just so gratified. The only thing I regret is that I am not going to be here to see the world that you built. But maybe I will, who knows. One of the things that, there was a question in here somewhere about what would you tell your younger self?
That's right.
And I would say, I would counsel patience. I would counsel, listen to the voice inside your head. It's there. I can remember the moment in Los Angeles in 1971, 72, that I first heard that voice loud and clear. It was paralyzing. And it said, you can't go. And I'm pretty sure if I had gone, I would have died that night. And I thought, well, it must have been my grandfather. And maybe it was. But over the years, there are places, like times and places I can identify that I heard a voice. And my guess is that voice has always been there. But I couldn't hear it because of the noise of the world. So I would counsel, you know it's right. Do that. Doesn't matter what anybody else is saying or doing. You know it's right. Listen to yourself. Like I said, when I went to Africa, I had I read hundreds of books in Africa, frankly. Books that had been donated by to the local library, by the British Literary Society, whatever it was. But there was a lot of stuff in that library that was not taught to me in high school or college.
Yeah.
But I still was relatively ignorant. Nobody's talking about slave trade. Although there's a book by Basil Davis in there. So not having a wide-ranging body of knowledge that one can accrue by reading and listening, it's hard to put the world together. Or you can look at something and not know what it is, because you need a reference. Yeah. So, yeah, educate yourself, listen to that voice, internal voice. Honor your ancestors. I didn't really start looking at my ancestors until the last 10 years. I mean, I knew my grandfather and mother and all of that, but I didn't know my grandparents, my great-grandparents, Annie and Calvin James, who were born as slaves in enslavement.
Wow.
In Oakland, Mississippi, and had to hide in a boxcar with their kids in 1877 to get across that Mississippi River out of the Delta, because they weren't going to let them travel. Even though they were ostensibly free, they needed people taking them crops in the Delta, and they would not let you travel. You start trying to get on a train, you find yourself listed as a vagrant and farmed out to some local farmer.
Wow.
So they hid. And they got help from a white man whose name is lost to history, but it's instructive because they weren't going to get out of Mississippi without his help. Just like I wasn't going to survive in Mississippi without those white kids there.
Wow.
So I didn't know about them. So they came across the river, they homesteaded some land through the Freedmen's Bureau. They were both illiterate, but they got 160 acres of hill country. I mean, it wasn't cotton land or where you grow corn and stuff, but it was the kind of land that you could raise 11 children on.
Wow. Yeah.
You know? And we still have some, I still own 5 acres of that land.
Wow.
Everybody in the family got their piece. My mother had 10 acres. When she died, I got 5. My sister got 5. And it's not worth it. I mean, every 20 years they cut wood off of it, but that's not it. What it is that's the legacy.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if my sons will value it the way I value it, but yeah. So I didn't know about them. I did in 2007. My wife and I got our DNA done by African ancestry,
Oh, nice.
and we were able to identify where my father's father's father came from, where my mother's mother came from, and where her mother's. Okay. So, you know, as a young man, 18, 19, 20 years old, I was never going to be a slave. They would have just had to kill me. But when I got my feedback, I was in a Detroit museum. We used to take kids down to the what's it called? Called the Wright, but the Black History Museum in Detroit. A beautiful place. So we used to take students down there, about 50 at a time, and go through the exhibit and have lunch and lots of conversations. But I was in that museum, and that's where I bought the kit, actually, to have my DNA done. And we got the results, and I'm sitting in that museum waiting for the kids to go through their tour. And I started to think about, there was a female child or young woman from Mali and Senegambia, which is the very area I lived in, who began a journey sometime before, probably before 1830, from that area into that slave castle that I didn't know existed until recently, well, the last 20 years. And Gorée Island, because there was only one slave castle in that area. Most of them were down the coast toward Nigeria and Ghana and all of that. But there's one there on Gorée Island. And in fact, I have a picture of it in my living room. A friend of mine's a photographer, took this beautiful picture. I got to thinking that this young woman made a fateful decision. She decided that no matter what, no matter how difficult it was, she was going to stay alive. And she stayed alive long enough to cross the Middle Passage and to have a female child. And that child made the same decision, stay alive. No matter how difficult slavery was, she stayed alive long enough to have a female child. And that went on, generation after generation of women, until it got to my mother, who was born in 1929.
Wow.
And that's the reason I get to sit here. So I sat there thinking, and I was really weeping. This foolish young man who was committed to throwing away his life rather than to be enslaved, jumping overboard, whatever that might be, attacking the guards. These women had made another decision. My wife always told me that was macho male bullshit, this whole thing about, falling on the spear. But that gave me another look at the world, seeing that DNA. And it's a bit humbling.
Mm.
It's important to be humble. I've not been accused of that a lot, but it's important.
I get that.
We done?
Well, I'm curious. So there was the one side you mentioned. What was your father's side for the DNA?
My father. So my mother's side was Mandinka.
Okay.
My father's side was Yoruba.
Oh wow. Okay.
My oldest son's middle name is Yoruba. In fact, I just got a book about Yoruba religion and how that has moved across the world. Mm-hmm. I've always been fascinated with Yoruba religion, and I didn't know why. And I can't say that it's a one-to-one thing, but yes, my father's side of the family are Yoruba.
Well, that's great to know.
And my wife's family is Igbo. So women only carry one chromosome, but I don't know if it's the X or the Y. So she can only trace her maternal.
Right.
But men carry X and Y, so you can trace both sides.
Yeah.
And it made a difference for us. Really did. It's like the people were having dinner last night, Jewish. And their people come from Russia. And I don't know how far they go back, relatives, but actually they still have some relatives in Russia. Ours is broken,
Yeah.
that link. Although clearly Henry Louis Gates has shown that if you have enough money, do all that research, you can get pretty far back. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens.
I hear that.
That's the next stage of life.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. What is some advice you would like to give for the younger generation?
It's really, I've said everything. Never give up, never quit. Love your people, live for them, and you'll never die. That's an odd thing to say, but it's what I believe. That I'm an educator. I was going to say I was, but no, I'm an educator. And so I used to give away books in my office. I gave away a lot of copies of Frederick Douglass's narrative.
Yeah.
And so I gave a copy to a young woman who ultimately wound up taking a class from me. And so halfway through the semester, I asked her, "So did you ever read that book?" And she said, "No, I left it on my nightstand and my 15-year-old brother took it, he read it." I'm like, that's what it's about. So I don't know what the words would be, selfless or whatever it is. That's not what it is. But what I've taught my students, whichever way I taught them, whether it was taking them somewhere or giving them a book or just in conversation, or you got to write that paper because I'm going to give you a grade, they carry that with them. And it will be reflected in their own children.
Wow.
So when I say you'll never die, that's what I mean.
Wow.
That you don't, see, education to me is like a ripple on a pond. Like you throw a pebble in there, you don't know where that ripple is going to hit, sure. And you don't know what tidal wave it may give rise to. But it's the faith of an educator, and you do it anyway, because you do have faith that it will hit shore. You just don't know when or where. So, give me the question again.
It sounded like you answered it. What's some wisdom you would share with the younger generation?
Oh, faith in yourself, brother. Faith in yourself. Love yourself. Love your family. Don't get seduced by the rage and the anger. There's a quote I use a lot. One of the books I gave away was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankel. Now, this is about, the first half is about his time in the concentration camp. And I don't know how the book came to me, but I was struggling with, probably in the 90s or something, or 80s, about how I was going to proceed with life. And somebody gave me this book, and I read the first half. The second half I don't read because it's psychological theory. But the first half I read, and it talked about who survived the camps. And his analysis is those people who had purpose beyond themselves. They had a reason to live beyond their own life, survived the camps. And he likes to quote Nietzsche, which is an Austrian, German, philosopher of the 1800s, maybe earlier, that what does not kill you will make you stronger. That's one thought. The other was a little more complicated. Those who chase monsters should be careful that they do not become monsters themselves. And I felt like in my 20s that was my road, that I stopped valuing life, my life or anybody else's life. And I was on the edge. And the rest of that quote is, if you look long into the abyss will look back into you. And the abyss is hell, in my opinion. So I'll have to go back and read why he used those two quotes. But for me, it was very instructive. You know, which wolf do you feed? And I'm just extraordinarily grateful that I get to be here. And perhaps I have more work to do. We'll see.
Let's see. Well, thank you so much, Baba Cole, for sharing your time and your words of wisdom with us. This has been excellent, and I'm just so glad that you've been a part of this journey every step of the way for the Brotherhood of Elders Oral History Project. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.